How American CEOs got so filthy rich. The highest paid CEO in America is Barry McCarthy, CEO of Peloton Interactive, raking in a hefty $168 million of compensation in 2022. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, is right behind at $99 million. That's an almost 60% gap. I never would have guessed selling fitness bikes and treadmills would make me richer than selling overpriced phones that you're probably using to watch this video right now. The 100th highest paid CEO, John R. Mueller of Procter & Gamble, also earns a respectable compensation at $17 million. Considering the national average salary in 2022 is $60,575, McCarthy made 2,773 times that. According to Lawrence Mitchell, a fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, the average CEOs are making 351 times more than what the average worker makes today. But in 1989, it was only 61 times more, and in 1978, it was even less, 31 times more. Something sinister is happening behind the scenes and has been happening for decades. The result? Employees keep getting poorer and CEOs keep getting richer. That's not all. Thanks to the pandemic causing a great transfer of wealth from the middle to high-income families, the increasingly chaotic labor system in America, and the uncertainty of inflation, big companies are getting bigger, and more CEOs will keep raking in billions. In contrast, regular workers like you keep breaking your back for minimal pay that can barely cover your rent. How did we get here? How did American CEOs get so filthy rich? Welcome to Gritflix, the channel that gives you high-quality mini-documentaries covering topics about money, power, and business. And this is the dark truth behind the wealth of American CEOs. What's in the stocks? Let's go back to the 1930s, the period immediately following the 1929 stock market crash. With billions of dollars in wealth having gone up in smoke, company owners had to take drastic measures to make money. They decided to buy shares of their company's stock from their investors, resulting in fewer stocks available for the public to buy. This created an artificial scarcity that drove up the prices of the remaining stocks. In the next couple of years, company owners followed the stock buyback trend and got ridiculously wealthy, much to the disadvantage of common people. By 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed a new law called the Securities and Exchange Act to curb illegal dealings such as fraud and insider trading, which ran rampant in the financial system. The law was effective in curbing these illegal activities. For the next 50 years, companies largely focused on increasing their assets and raising worker wages, which effectively created the American middle class. This slow and steady growth was disrupted during the Reagan administration, which prioritized market deregulation, privatization of the public sector, and free market capitalism over better wages and working conditions. Let the companies go wild and under less scrutiny. After all, the great economist Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of Nations, had famously written the concept of laissez-faire, or leave alone, where the economy would benefit best from little to no government intervention and regulations. If he wrote it, it must be right? Well, with less scrutiny, companies were free to buy back shares of their stocks from investors, which they did in increasing amounts over the years. By 2007, America's biggest companies spent a whopping 77% of their profits on buyback shares, with CEO compensations becoming tied with the company's share prices. This meant that the higher the CEO could get the stock prices to go up, the more money they would get. Today, companies spend 65% of their profits on buyback shares, leading to an all-time high gap between CEO pay and the average worker's salary. The average American with a decent job making $50,000 annually still lives paycheck to paycheck and hopes to avoid unexpected expenses, while CEOs sign sweet million-dollar deals with the company board. Ouch. It would take an average American 351 years to make the same amount of money that his or her CEO makes in a year. This reality is even more baffling when compared to the experience of workers in countries outside America, where the CEO to worker pay ratio is only about 117 to 1. Accountable to investors, not the company. Having your salary tied to your company's stock performance also resulted in accountability issues. Imagine if your $10 million bonus would only be paid if the company hit $100 billion in revenue this year and the company's stock price increased from $50 to $100. Naturally, you do all you can to meet the targets. Just take a look at Enron, an industry titan reduced to oblivion overnight because of the greed of its executives. Enron was an energy and utilities supplier company based in Houston, Texas, but more importantly, it was a monolith in its industry, the type of company you expect to continue existing and driving out competition for centuries. At its peak, Enron's shares were worth $90.75, but after a dizzying fall from grace, the company's stock was barely worth 26 cents before declaring bankruptcy. Enron was formed in 1985 after a merger between Houston Natural Gas Co. and Inter North Inc. Kenneth Lay from Houston Natural Gas became Enron's CEO. He would later appoint Jeffrey Skilling as the company's new head accountant. By the 1990s, Enron was already one of the biggest players in the energy field. Due to deregulation of the energy markets, companies could place bets on future stock prices with derivatives trading, and Enron executives were ready to hunt. Skilling started using an accounting method called MTM, market to market, which measures the value of a security based on its market value rather than its book value. Essentially, Enron would create an asset, for example, a power plant, and estimated its future profits from it. Then, they would immediately claim the profit in their books today, even though they had not made a single cent from it. Heck, imagine if you started a restaurant and estimated a future. Let's say a modest $1 million revenue a month when your actual sales was only $10,000. You tell your investors you're running $1 million business, and sure enough, that's the number you wrote in your financial statement. Sounds crazy? Well, that's what Enron did. Even better, if the asset eventually underperforms and didn't yield the estimated profit, Enron would transfer the asset to an off-the-books special purpose vehicles, SPVs, to hide their debts and liabilities rather than take the loss publicly. Those SPVs were practically the graveyard of Enron's failures. This way, the loss went unreported. Because of this crafty accounting hack, Enron could make itself look more profitable than it was while mounting debt upon debt behind the scenes. This attracted more and more unwitting investors who placed their trust in a company that seemed highly profitable on the outside but was rotting on the inside. Unsurprisingly, Enron was unable to keep with this shady accounting fraud for long. Once the 2000 recession hit, Enron came to crumble from the top of the industry as the losses became too much to hide. By the end of 2001, Enron had filed for bankruptcy. This mindset of being accountable only to investors led to revenue and stock price-minded doggedness plaguing corporate America, preventing them from focusing on making the world a better place. It's why Jeff Bezos can refuse to give his staff a reasonable raise, thereby forcing them to protest, while he and his girlfriend enjoy a 5-star, no-expenses-spared holiday in London. It's why Apple decided to produce its phones, iPads, iPods, etc. in China because of cheaper labor, which meant more profits to shareholders. The sexy trend of CEO taking $1 salaries weren't helping either, because actually their biggest income was still from the company's stocks they owned. Elon Musk was among the famous $1 salary CEOs, yet he is the second wealthiest person in the world, with a net worth of $173 billion. Mark Zuckerberg's $1 salary still gave him a modest net worth of $86.5 billion, and Larry Ellison had a $102.6 billion fortune. Most of these $1 salary CEOs adopted this method to avoid paying huge taxes to the government and helped create a positive, if possibly untrue, selfless image to the public. Their profits came back to them in company stocks, which they, of course, owned a large share. Superstar CEO. Since companies are now more focused on enriching their investors, CEOs have attained a sort of superstar status. For the company owners or board of directors, the CEO is the main character in any companies. Cue the sharp suits, expensive whiskey, private jets, and 50 assistants armed with everything Mr. CEO requires to function daily. CEOs have become the LeBron James of the corporate world for helping their companies achieve higher and higher revenues. So, they have to be paid accordingly. Never mind that without the workers putting their backs into it, the CEO is nothing. There's also the fact that scarcity increases prices. Since superstar CEOs who get the job done are so rare, the few who develop stellar reputations have an even bigger leverage. As Robin Farrakhan, CEO of Farian Advisors, says, if you have a good CEO, the multiplier effect can be huge. So, in principle, median pay for median performance and high pay for high performance makes sense. Competitive pay. The scarcity of good CEOs makes it difficult for companies to find one willing to settle. Companies decide how much to pay their CEOs based on compensation committees, which usually comprise of board members and executives from other companies. Aside from the usual parameters like measures of experience and performance, the committees determine CEO pay using a benchmark where they compare the CEO's potential salary with that of CEOs at similar companies. Then, they set the salary slightly higher than what other companies would offer. This, in turn, leads to a situation Robert Solow, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, describes as living in Lake Wobegon. Lake Wobegon is this fictional town created by radio show host Garrison Kaler, where all children are supposedly above average. Every company wants an excellent CEO, so they keep jacking up the salary to attract the best. Eventually, CEO salaries increase exponentially compared to regular worker salaries, which grow at a snail's pace. Companies can get away with placing so much priority on their CEOs at the expense of other employees due to several factors. Firstly, unemployment is getting higher. The unemployment rate in the US has increased to 3.6% since February 2023 from the previous rate of 3.4%. Job seekers are more likely to settle for crumbs now since many people are vying for the same job. Employers also have a better opportunity to ask employees to sign non-compete clauses. Next, the erosion of unions has also made it less likely for workers to bargain collectively, which would have increased their bargaining power. Then there's globalization, which allows employers to find the cheapest labor from different parts of the world. The lack of better labor laws affects workers negatively in areas where working conditions, health insurance, and minimum wages aren't protected and guaranteed, all in the name of profits. Possible solutions? Lawrence Mitchell believes the matter may not be as complicated as we think. Having previously worked at places like the U.S. Department of Labor and Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations, he ought to have a solid understanding in labor-related matters. He believes a concept as simple as shame can influence a change in current labor practices. Bring back shame. If CEOs could get 100 times richer during a global pandemic that resulted in hundreds of thousands of people getting laid off, then perhaps they ought to feel some level of shame. Because, in reality, the workers are the backbone of the companies making its investors and CEOs rich. CEOs who go out of their way are great, if only to provide evidence that it is possible to sustain a business where the workers earn a reasonable income and the CEO makes less. Take Dan Price, for example, the CEO who cut his salary to allow every single employee to go home with at least $70,000 yearly. People initially projected that the company would go bankrupt in a couple of years, but 7 years later, the company is still going strong. Imagine that, a company paying its workers what they deserve and still running a profitable business. But Mitchell also believes that an even more effective approach towards bridging the pay gap between workers and CEOs is through legislation. He referenced the American Rescue Plan bill, which was targeted at reducing unemployment to 3.5% by the fall of 2022. There is also the Reconciliation Bill, aimed at creating penalties for companies that violate worker union rights, and a Biden executive order that asks the FTC to implement rules limiting or preventing employers from forcing non-compete clauses on employees. Democratic Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are also pushing for abolishing the Reagan-era rule that enables the buyback culture. They believe that by stripping off that legal protection, they can scare companies away from doing buybacks and screwing retail investors. Republican Senator Marco Rubio has also suggested giving extra tax breaks to companies that reinvest their profits rather than spending it on buybacks. With legislation like this in force, it will be more difficult for CEOs to rake in billions yearly. So maybe workers can finally afford to take a vacation or two because, they deserve it. The unchecked capitalism practiced in America may be responsible for CEOs earning as much as they do at the expense of other workers. However, some countries practice capitalism, and the pay gap between CEOs and other employees is not as large as in America. So, is the root of the problem the government? Is it capitalism itself? Is it another factor, or a combination of all three? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed today's video. Also, check out our video on Dana White and how he turned UFC from $44 million in debt into a $4 billion empire, or on why Taiwan's chip dominance is under threat from China.